Paragraph 15, he says it this way: thus architecture is called frozen music by de Stael and Goethe. Virtuous thought, an architect should be a musician, right? A Gothic church, said Coleridge, is a petrified religion. And in paragraph 16, he says it this way: a right action seems to fill the eye and to be related to all nature. The wise man in doing one thing does all, or in the one thing he does rightly, he sees the likeness of all which is done rightly. Yeah, that's the last one that I want to give to you from that reading. I have a tendency to want to just read more and more of this stuff to you. Let's jump to chapter 6 really quickly, and idealism. Well, the question is a question about subjective truth, right? How do we verify the truth of external reality, right? In other words, go back to Plato's cave allegory. There are those dwellers in the cave thinking that those shadows on the wall are in fact real, when in fact they are not real. He makes an observation that a carpenter, like an average person, doesn't want to know that what he's looking at are shadows on the wall. And the question in the end, he says, about whether we can actually prove that what is in front of us is real or not is an unanswerable question. And in the end, he says it doesn't matter if external reality exists or not, because we're here and we have to exist. Emerson's discussion then leads to idealism. Visual changes, distortions caused by mechanical apparatuses, or we can physically change our environment, and therefore we're not built, he says, like a ship to be tossed, but like a house to stand. We long for some kind of stability, in other words, in our understanding, and that is why we need concepts, ergo idealism. And he says it: a poet will manipulate nature, and he gives some references from Shakespeare's Tempest, and he makes the observation that time is like the chest of the lover that one can't escape from. And then he gets into this notion of the poet, who's going to always be interested in beauty, versus the philosopher and the scientist, who's always going to be interested in truth. And he says it: all people can train their mind to see that second box. Of course, the question has to do with ethics and religion as it relates to nature. Ethics and religion, of course, are in many ways so important because you can control nature, put nature underfoot, is the way he actually will say it in chapter 6. He says the problem with religion, though, is that very often it leads people to believe that they should hate the physical world and the body, and Emerson's obviously going to have some issues with that. He says don't inquire too much into ethics and religion. Ideas are important, he says, because they lead to power. And the circle, again, is a great symbol because it represents that power. We think of the yin-yang symbol of Taoism, don't we, right? Everything is somehow interrelated, and everyone, therefore, is interrelated, right? And this notion, then, of ideas ultimately will provide us with the idea of the supreme being, right? And this, again, is that distinction that we made before. Two views of God in Christian thought. God loves, a word picture of, affection or whatever, and then God is love. Give a word picture for that, as we said in earlier lectures. This is Emerson's God, this nature with a capital N. And this is our understanding of transcendentalism, to transcend beyond the first box of the physical to the second box of the metaphysical. That is transcendentalism. All right, let's jump into chapter 6 now and do some reading from some of those paragraphs. I'll jump to paragraph 3. The frivolous of chapter 7. The frivolous make themselves merry with the ideal theory, as if its consequences were burlesque, as if it affected the stability of nature. It surely does not. God never jests with us, and will not compromise the end of nature by permitting any inconsequence in its precision. Any distrust in the permanence of laws would paralyze the faculties of man. The permanence is sacredly respected, and his faith therein is perfect. The wheels and springs of man are all set to the hypotheses of the permanence of nature. So, and he says it, we are not built like a ship to be tossed, but like a house to stand. What a great line. We'll continue. Paragraph number 5. He says, the best moments of life are these delicious awakenings of the higher powers and the reverential withdrawing of nature before its God. Paragraph number 6. He says, turn the eyes upside down by looking at the landscape through your legs, and how agreeable is the picture, though you have seen it any time these 20 years. What a compelling notion. We once had students in 303 lay down on the floor and look up at the ceiling. And we commented, the room hasn't changed, but yet it seems to have changed, because we have this tendency to look at things over and over again, repeatedly, and we don't see the new. And this is, of course, the suggestion that's being made. In paragraph number 8, he says, the poet conforms things to his thoughts. And then in paragraph number 12, he says, the problem of philosophy, according to Plato, is for all that exists conditionally to find a ground unconditioned and absolute. The true philosophy continues, and the true poet are one. And then to paragraph number 15, he says, and no man touches these divine natures without becoming in some degree himself divine. This is pure Emerson. Like a new soul, they renew the body. We become physically nimble and lightsome. We tread on air. Life is no longer irksome, and we think it will never be so. Listen to the optimism of these lines. No man fears age or misfortune or death in their serene company, for he is transported out of the district of change, whilst we behold unveiled the nature of justice and truth, both capitalized. We learn the difference between the absolute and the conditional or relative. We apprehend the absolute, as it were, for the first time. We exist. We become immortal, for we learn that time and space are relations of matter, that with a perception of truth or a virtuous will, they have no affinity. And then finally, in paragraph 18, he says it this way, idealism sees the world in God. And again, this notion of God for us is a transpersonal understanding of deity. All right, let's jump to chapter 7 quickly. This one he calls spirit. The argument here is that nature provides us with these mystical truths that are beyond ordinary understanding. You can't define, he says, the spirit that permeates nature, but we feel that it exists, he says. And then Emerson asks his 3 famous questions. A, what is matter, out of which nature is made? And here he calls it phenomena, not substance. Nature is something experienced, yet somehow nature remains a mystery. B, where did matter come from? And C, toward what end did matter come? Nature's animating spirit, he says, expresses itself through us. And then he shares what he considers to be the highest truth. There is a universal essence that is present in each and every object, obviously in humans. And of course the question is, if it's in all humans, well then even, for example, of Emerson's day in slaves, you can see where the abolitionist movement and the argument for abolitionism is actually going to come for Emerson, right? If we are all humans and therefore all divine, that includes both slave owner and slave, right? But the problem, of course, is that, and by the way, this universal essence is the source of our life force. That is energy. Energy, which we say, of course, today, cannot be either created or destroyed. Talk to any theologian, and the theologian will say about God, that which can be neither created nor destroyed. And Emerson would say, well, that's exactly what we say about energy. Talk to any poet, and a poet would say, well, that's exactly what we say about love. You can kind of see how these terms get interchanged, right, back and forth. The problem, of course, is that we forget. We forget who and what we are. And this, of course, we could call sin. Emerson doesn't call it this, but we could call it sin. The goal then is to reawaken. We think of Thoreau's famous line, we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our darkest hours. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability for a man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. Those lines from Walden. And compelling lines. I mean, Emerson had a tremendous influence, I think, on those lines of Thoreau's. All right, let's jump into the chapter 7 readings. For paragraph, we'll go to paragraph number 2. The aspect of nature is devout. Like the figure of Jesus, she stands with bended head and hands folded upon the breast. The happiest man is he who learns from nature the lesson of worship. What a great line. And of course, we've already done an essay called Worship of Emerson's. Paragraph number 3, he says, of that ineffable essence we call spirit, he that thinks most will say least. Sounding very much like the Tao Te Ching, for those of you that know Taoism. In paragraph number 7, he says it this way, as a plant upon the earth, So a man rests upon the bosom of God. He's nourished by unfailing fountains and draws at his need inexhaustible power. What a great line. It's beautiful stuff, right? And then finally in paragraph 8 he says, we are as much strangers in nature as we are aliens from God. And again, this dislocation is a big part of the of understanding Emerson's argument. All right, let's turn now to the last chapter, Prospects. And the question is, how to study nature? Intuition, he says, is greater than calculated measurements of science and geology, right? Empirical science, for example, the hard sciences, love detailed observations, but they miss, Emerson says, the integration into the larger whole. The way he says it is, untaught sallies of the spirit are much greater and the best way to learn. Think about Whitman's Learned Astronomer, right? He says, when I was sitting there and the guy was going through all the charts, it was so boring, I was ready to get out of it, and I walk out and I look up at the night sky and I see the stars. That word mystic, of course, is there, that mystical union. He didn't need to have somebody teach him about the stars. He just needed to experience those. Reason, he says, intuition is greater than understanding, mere observation. However, we must understand before we can reason. We're limited, he says, because we assume that understanding and reason are the same. Each human, he says, is a microcosm. And he quotes George Herbert, a Renaissance poet. Nature, he says, is a household organized for our well-being. And then he talks about Amos Bronson Alcott, a fellow transcendentalist who he calls his Orphic poet. He says, we've fallen from our former utopia, where there was wholeness and unity with nature. And this is the source of all ills and evils. This is the theodicy question that Milton will have raised in Paradise Lost in our lectures there. And therefore sin is a forgetting of the spiritual truths that are of the second box. I mean, we said this in an earlier lecture. Remember our Scrooge story, right? I mean, he's upset when he sees the past, and even more upset when he sees the present. But it's when somebody shows him his tombstone, that is to say the moment of his death, that he's ready to fall down on his knees and start begging for his life. As we have said in earlier lectures from Phaedo and elsewhere for the Harvard Classics, at our moment of death, we all say, oh my God, the words are the same. The only question is the inflection of the voice. For most of us, when we die, it's, what have I done with my life? That's Scrooge, remember? And he begs for one more chance. This is the Emersonian insight, right? The solution, he says, and the healing is to be open to nature, to enjoy the enlightenment, the healing powers. We think again of the restorative nature, the restorative powers of nature from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey in our lecture there. Think about the word picture of the dirty light bulb. The light bulb is on, but you can't see the light. You gotta get all that mud and stuff off of it. Think about Plato's cave allegory and how well that works. Reflection and intuition lead to the uniting of humanity in regards to harmony, which leads to perfection and that undivided whole. The question, of course, is always, again, as we've said in earlier lectures, whether we're going back to Eden or we're going up from Eden. Let's jump in now to chapter 8 and finish with some great readings from different places. Here, paragraph 3. The perception of this class of truths makes the attraction which draws men to science, but the end is lost sight of in attention to the means. In the view of this half-sight of science, we accept the sentence of Plato that poetry comes nearer to vital truth than history. And then later he says, a wise writer will feel that the ends of study and composition are best answered by announcing undiscovered regions of thought, and so communicating through hope new activity to the torrid spirit, what we call as 303 discovery writing, correct? In paragraph number 7, he says, a man is a god in ruins. It's a famous line. A man is a god in ruins. When men are innocent, life shall be longer and shall pass into the immortal as gently as we awake from dreams. Now the world would be insane and rabid if these disorganizations should last for hundreds of years. It's kept in check by death and infancy. Infancy is the perpetual Messiah, which comes into the arms of fallen men and pleads with them to return to paradise. What a great line that one is. And then to finish, he says it this way: deep calls unto deep. He says in paragraph number 10, and then finally he says it then. Know then in paragraph 12. Know then that the world exists for you. Well, let's finish now quickly at 2a. major messages. Nature is the key to all success, the great teacher. And again, this forgetting is the biggest problem, right? We forget that the second box is there and is important. The poet, the artist, is the key to society. At level 2B, the rhetoric, Emerson's powerful word pictures, his tone of enthusiasm and optimism, and at times his ironic voice. At 3A, and the way we want to relate to other texts, of course, we've mentioned Plato's Republic, Thoreau's Walden, we even quoted from. What's your favorite movie or song about nature? All other Emerson essays that we've studied, how do you relate them? And finally, at 3B, the question here is to relate to self. Do you buy this argument about nature providing us with that notion of the moral sentiment and ethics? And what is dangerous about it in your estimation? And what is your, finally, this is our last lecture on Emerson, so we'll ask it now. What is your opinion of Emerson? What are his most important ideas for you? Thank you so much. We're out of time. There's the bell, and I appreciate our opportunities to talk Emerson with you. Thank you.